What could possibly make a man who has everything, a millionaire surrounded by wealth, power, and influence, feel shaken by the words of a child who had nothing? Picture this. In the heart of New York City, where the lights never dim and the streets echo with the rush of ambition, a man named Richard Miller steps out of his sleek black car. His tailored suit, his polished shoes, and the towering guards at his side all send a single message: untouchable authority. But then, cutting through the noise of honking taxis and hurried footsteps, comes a faint, trembling voice. A boy, thin, barefoot and hungry, looks up at Richard and whispers, "Sir, could you spare me some bread?" It was a simple request. Not for money, not for privilege, but for the most basic human need, food. Yet instead of compassion, what came next was arrogance. Richard, his pride swelling in front of the crowd, waved his hand with cold indifference. His guards moved quickly, pushing the frail boy aside as if he were nothing, more than a nuisance. Have you ever seen a moment where someone's wealth or pride blinded them so much that they forgot the value of another human being? Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to discover now may surprise you. That single humiliating scene drew the attention of bystanders. Some turned away, too uncomfortable to watch. Others murmured in disapproval, their eyes following the boy as he stumbled back, still clutching his empty stomach. But then, just as the guards thought they had silenced him, the child's voice rose again. This time it carried not weakness but an unsettling strength. His words would slice through Richard's pride like a knife through glass, echoing louder than the sounds of the busy street. In that instant, New York wasn't just a city of wealth and opportunity. It became a stage where arrogance and innocence collided. Richard, the powerful millionaire who believed money could solve any problem, suddenly found himself confronted with a truth he wasn't prepared to hear. Have you ever been caught off guard by words so simple, yet so profound, that they forced you to stop and think about your own life? That is exactly what happened to Richard Miller on that rainy afternoon, under the neon lights of Manhattan. Because here's the truth: money can build skyscrapers, buy luxury cars, and command respect, but it cannot purchase kindness, and it cannot erase guilt. For years, Richard had lived with the belief that power made him untouchable, but this encounter would mark the beginning of a deep, internal struggle, one that no amount of wealth could shield him from. And it all started with a beggar child who refused to let his voice be silenced. Imagine being there in that moment, standing among the crowd, witnessing the contrast of a millionaire's pride against the fragile courage of a hungry boy. Which side would you have felt drawn to? The man with the fortune, or the child with nothing but honesty in his heart? These questions don't just belong to Richard, they belong to us too. What you're about to hear is more than just a story of a wealthy man and a poor child. It's a mirror, reflecting the way arrogance can blind us and humility can wake us up. So, stay close, because the words that left a crowd in silence and left a millionaire trembling are words you'll never forget. And they are only the beginning. Because just when Richard thought he had silenced a child forever, destiny had prepared a lesson that would turn his entire world upside down. And that's where our story begins. And maybe, as you listen to this story, you've already remembered a moment when life put you face to face with arrogance, or when a simple word touched you more deeply than anything money could buy. If this feeling is stirring inside you, don't keep it only to yourself. Share it. Write in the comments what this scene awakens in you, or if you've ever seen something similar happen in real life. When you share your thoughts, you're not just leaving a comment. You're helping build a space where people can reflect, connect, and feel less alone in what they've lived through. And if this story has already moved you in some way, I'd like to ask something simple. Leave a like on this video. That small gesture tells me and the platform that these messages matter, that they deserve to keep reaching people who need to hear them. Your like is more than support. It's a way of saying, this touched me, and I want more. People to feel it too. And if you've come this far, it probably means this kind of content speaks to you. So subscribe to the channel. By doing that, you're not only making sure you won't miss the next stories, we'll actually walk this path together. Every subscription, every interaction strengthens this community of people who believe in stories that carry meaning, lessons, and emotion. Stay with me, because what comes next in this story is even more powerful. The boy's words didn't just echo. In the street that day, they began to tear down walls inside the millionaire's heart, and it's right there, in that fragile silence after arrogance, that the true transformation begins. Richard Miller had always believed that money was more than just currency, it was control. To him, wealth wasn't simply about comfort or luxury, it was the very foundation of respect. He lived his life with the certainty that every door could be opened, every problem solved, and every voice silenced if the price was right. In his world, cash was power, and power was everything. He rose each morning in his penthouse high above Manhattan, where the glass windows gave him a panoramic view of the city that seemed to bow before him. Black SUVs waited in the private garage below, polished to perfection, engines humming softly like obedient soldiers ready to escort their commander. Two guards, each built like stone walls, shadowed his every move. Their dark suits blended seamlessly with his own tailored attire, and together they projected an image of untouchable authority. People didn't dare to approach him, not because they knew who he was, but because of the aura he carried. "Keep the car ready," Richard would say, his voice calm yet commanding, as though even time itself had to obey his schedule. His assistants scrambled to anticipate his needs. Phones buzzed constantly with meetings and decisions worth millions, and in the skyscraper office that bore his name in silver letters, people spoke in hushed tones whenever he entered the room. He was the kind of man who made others nervous simply by existing. But behind the sharp suit and the polished shoes was a man who had long buried his softer edges. He convinced himself that compassion was weakness, that empathy could be exploited. Success had hardened him, shaping a mindset that equated vulnerability with failure. If anyone questioned his lack of generosity, Richard's answer was always the same: "I worked for this. If they want more, they should work for it too." To him, life was simple math: winners and losers, strength and weakness, wealth and poverty. Yet for all his pride, there was an uneasiness he rarely admitted, even to himself. At night, when the city lights glittered beneath his penthouse windows, there were moments when silence pressed in too heavily. He would pour himself another glass of whiskey and stare at the skyline, trying to drown the faint but persistent thought that maybe he had lost something on his way up. But by morning, the armor of arrogance was back in place. He could dismiss anything with a smirk, burying doubts beneath another deal, another display of control. Richard thrived on appearances. Every move he made was calculated to reinforce his image. When he stepped out of his car, the crowd noticed. When he entered a restaurant, conversations paused. He wasn't just a man, he was a performance. And he liked it that way. Respect, he believed, wasn't earned. It was bought, demanded, and displayed. Still, even in the carefully constructed world he built, there were cracks he refused to see. The guards who trailed him weren't just for protection. They were a barrier between him and the world he no longer understood. Strangers saw the expensive watch on his wrist, but none noticed how tightly he clenched his jaw. His employees admired his decisiveness, but none recognized the loneliness behind his sharp tone. Richard Miller was surrounded by people, but untouched by them. "Don't waste my time," he would often say, cutting off conversations that wandered too close to personal matters. To him, efficiency was more valuable than empathy. Time was money, and money was his kingdom. And yet, for all the skyscrapers that bore his influence, there was one truth he couldn't buy his way out of. No amount of fortune could shield him from the impact of words he wasn't ready to hear. Because in the middle of all this luxury, all this pride, and all this calculated distance, life was preparing him for a moment that would unravel everything he thought he knew. One decision, made casually on a street corner, would expose the hidden truth behind the walls he had built. And it wouldn't come from another millionaire or a rival in business. It would come from the voice of a child who had nothing to give except honesty. As Richard's world of steel and glass seemed so firmly in place, destiny was quietly arranging an encounter that would remind him how fragile even the strongest empires can be when confronted with humility. And as he stepped into that day, unaware of the journey waiting for him, his belief that money was the final word on power was about to be tested in a way he never imagined. Ethan's world could not have been more different from Richard's, where Richard's mornings began with the sweep of city views from glass towers. Ethan started with the chill of dawn, creeping through the thin walls of a rundown shelter. His clothes were too small for him, the fabric worn thin and stained from weeks of wear. His shoes, once handed down by someone else, had long since fallen apart, leaving his bare feet to carry him over the cold, unforgiving pavement of the city. Yet, in his eyes, there was still a flicker of something untouched, something that neither hunger nor hardship had managed to extinguish. On that particular day, the smell of fresh bread drifted from a bakery on the corner. The golden loaves stacked in the window were warm, their crusts glistening under the morning light, each one a silent temptation. Ethan's stomach growled, sharp and insistent, reminding him how long it had been since his last real meal. He stood there, his small frame pressed against the window, not with bitterness, but with a fragile kind of hope. He didn't dream of riches or luxuries. At that moment, all he wanted was a piece of bread, something simple, something human, something to remind him that he still belonged in a world that often seemed to forget him. People passed him without stopping, their eyes fixed on their own destinations. Some glanced at him with pity before looking away, as though his presence was a reminder of a truth they didn't want to face. Others ignored him completely, their footsteps echoing against the sidewalk as if he wasn't even there. Ethan was used to that. He had learned early on that in a city of millions, being invisible was sometimes the hardest part. Still, there was no anger in him. Instead, he whispered quietly to himself, as though trying to convince his own heart that things would change. Maybe today someone will listen. Maybe today someone will care. His voice was soft, almost like a prayer, carried away by the noise of traffic and the hum of life rushing past him. What made Ethan different wasn't just his innocence, it was the way he held on to it despite everything. Many children in his situation would have hardened, built walls around themselves, mirrored the indifference they received from others. But Ethan's strength was quiet resilience. He still believed in kindness. He still believed that even strangers could surprise you. That belief was his anchor, and though it seemed fragile, it was stronger than any armor pride could build. As he stood near the bakery, hunger twisting his stomach, Ethan's gaze lifted to the line of cars waiting at the stoplight across the street. His eyes landed on one in particular, sleek and black, with tinted windows that reflected the city back like a mirror. When the door opened and Richard Miller stepped out with his guards, Ethan didn't see power or intimidation. He saw a man who might help, a man who, beneath the expensive suit and polished shoes, might still have a heart. He gathered his courage, the kind of courage only a child can have, the kind born not of confidence, but of desperation. Crossing the street carefully, he approached the car, his small hand trembling slightly as he tapped on the window. The guards stiffened, their eyes narrowing, but Ethan's voice was soft, almost pleading. "Sir," he said, barely above the noise of the traffic, "could you spare me some bread?" It wasn't money he asked for. He didn't dare to dream that high. It was food, the simplest of human needs, the one thing that separated survival from suffering. There was no deceit in his tone, no manipulation in his eyes, just hunger, just truth. That moment, so ordinary to those who witnessed it, yet so monumental in Ethan's Life would become the spark that lit the clash between arrogance and innocence. Richard's empire of pride, built on decisions and appearances, was about to collide with the quiet strength of a barefoot child whose only weapon was honesty. And as the city pulsed around them, filled with people too busy to notice, the hidden truth of that encounter was preparing to unfold in a way that neither of them could have foreseen. The city seemed to pause for a heartbeat as Ethan's small voice reached Richard. "Sir, I'm hungry." It was not a demand, not even a cry, but a whisper carried by the weight of empty days and nights. For an instant, the air between them was heavy, filled with a possibility Richard never allowed himself to entertain: compassion. But just as quickly as it appeared, he crushed it. Richard's eyes narrowed, not with pity, but with irritation, as though the child's words were an unwelcome interruption to the performance of his life. He shifted his gaze to the guards, his hand lifting with effortless precision, and with a simple snap of his fingers, the decision was made. To him, it wasn't even a choice. It was instinct, the automatic response of a man who saw the boy not as a human being, but as a distraction. "Get him out of here," Richard muttered, his tone sharp, cold and dismissive. The guards moved forward immediately, their presence towering over Ethan. One of them placed a firm hand on the boy's shoulder, pushing him back with the same detachment one might use to clear away trash from a doorstep. Ethan stumbled slightly but didn't resist. His wide eyes lifted toward Richard, silently searching for a trace of kindness, some hidden truth that might reveal a softer heart behind the steel exterior. But all he saw was a man who wouldn't even meet his gaze. "I just wanted bread," Ethan whispered again, his words trembling as he tried to steady himself. There was no anger in his tone, only confusion. How could something so simple, something so small, be treated as if it were an insult? Richard's jaw tightened. "Move him. I don't have time for this." The injustice of the moment lingered in the air, felt by those who happened to glance at the scene from the sidewalk. A woman carrying groceries slowed her steps, her brow furrowing at the sight. A man waiting at the corner shook his head, muttering something under his breath before walking away. Yet no one stepped forward. No one intervened. In a city filled with voices, silence often became the loudest sound. For Richard, this was nothing more than routine. He had built a mindset where every decision was about maintaining control, appearances, and the image of authority. To him, showing compassion to the boy might look like weakness, and weakness, in his world, was unacceptable. He convinced himself that he was simply protecting his time, guarding his space, and moving forward as always. What he didn't realize was that the impact of this single moment would follow him far beyond the busy streets of Manhattan. Ethan, though small and frail, stood with a quiet dignity that no guard could push away. His thin frame wavered against the firm grip on his arm, but his voice carried something that even Richard could not fully ignore. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it was honest. "One day, sir," Ethan said softly, his eyes fixed on Richard, "your money won't matter, but kindness always will." The words cut through the chaos of the street like a knife. The guard froze for half a second, glancing at Richard as if unsure whether to continue. The people passing by, though still moving, seemed to feel the shift in the air. There was something different about the tone of the boy's voice, something that carried beyond his fragile body. Richard forced a short laugh, dismissive, meant to cover the flicker of discomfort rising inside him. "Get him away," he repeated, sharper this time, as though volume could bury the truth of what he had just heard. But deep down, even as Ethan was pushed toward the sidewalk, those words lodged themselves like a thorn in his pride. For the boy, the encounter was over. For Richard, it had only just begun. He turned toward the black car, adjusting his cufflinks, trying to slip back into the rhythm of his carefully controlled world. Yet the whisper lingered, echoing louder than the honking horns and hurried footsteps of the city. The arrogance that once seemed impenetrable had been cracked, not by power, but by the quiet honesty of a starving child. And as Richard settled into the leather seat of his car, pretending nothing had happened, the journey he never planned to take was already unfolding. The hidden truth of that moment was not in the act of pushing the boy away. It was in the way his words refused to leave, and that was something Richard could not escape, no matter how tightly he tried to hold on to his pride. The street did not forget what had just happened. Even as Ethan was pushed aside and Richard retreated into the cocoon of his luxury car, the scene hung in the air like smoke after a fire. People who had been rushing to work slowed their steps, drawn not only by the image of a powerful man rejecting a hungry child, but also by the hidden truth that such moments revealed about the society around them. The city, always loud and restless, suddenly carried a silence between its sounds, a silence filled with judgment. A woman carrying shopping bags paused near the curb. She didn't know Ethan's name, but the sight of his thin body standing barefoot on the cold pavement struck her harder than she expected. "Poor kid," she murmured, shaking her head, though her voice carried enough that others around her heard. Another man, adjusting his tie as he waited for the light to change, whispered to the person beside him, "That guy's worth millions, and he couldn't even give the boy a piece of bread." Their words blended with the noise of the city, yet the tone was sharp, cutting through the air with quiet disapproval. It wasn't just what Richard had done, it was how easily he had done it. The arrogance of wealth displayed openly had exposed more than his pride. It had shown the imbalance of power that made people uneasy. The passers-by may not have known his name, but they recognized the type, the kind of man who measured worth not in humanity, but in status. For them, it wasn't just a story about a rich man and a poor child. It was a revelation about the distance between two worlds that shared the same sidewalk, yet lived in entirely different realities. Richard, however, noticed the stares. As the guards closed the car door behind him, he could feel the weight of eyes pressing against the tinted glass. He straightened his posture, adjusted his tie, and forced a smirk that was more armor than expression. "People always misunderstand strength," he muttered, almost to himself. But even as he said it, something inside him flickered with unease. Ethan, standing a few feet away, did not look angry. He didn't curse, didn't shout, didn't beg again. Instead, he lifted his gaze toward the car with a kind of calm that unsettled those watching. The boy's quiet dignity clashed sharply with Richard's loud display of authority. And that contrast, the humility of the child against the indifference of the millionaire, was what left bystanders whispering long after the car pulled away. There was a man in a worn-out jacket who lingered at the corner, watching Richard's SUV disappear down the avenue. "Funny thing about pride," he said to no one in particular, "it's the heaviest thing a man can carry and the easiest to break." His words hung in the air, a reflection of the impact the encounter had left behind. The city has a way of remembering. Behind the scenes, in hushed conversations and fleeting glances, the story began to spread, not as gossip, but as a quiet acknowledgement that something profound had just unfolded in plain sight. The balance of power had been displayed so clearly that it unsettled even those who had grown used to walking past beggars on the street. It wasn't just Ethan who had been seen, it was Richard, and the truth of who he had chosen to be in that moment. Inside the car, though insulated from the cold and the murmurs outside, Richard shifted uncomfortably. He told himself that the whispers didn't matter, that strangers' opinions were irrelevant to a man of his stature, and yet, as the driver pulled into traffic, he caught his own reflection in the window. For a split second, he didn't see the confident businessman he always presented. He saw a man who had turned his back on a child. He blinked, straightened again, and tried to bury the thought. But just as Ethan's words had lodged themselves like a thorn in his pride, the public's reaction was a mirror he couldn't completely escape. The imbalance of that moment, the sharp line between wealth and hunger, arrogance and humility, was etched into the street, into the memories of those who had witnessed it. Richard thought he could dismiss it as easily as snapping his fingers, but life has a way of following us in unexpected ways. And as the car rolled forward, carrying him deeper into the rhythm of his carefully controlled world, the unease traveled with him, quiet but persistent, preparing to unravel more than he could imagine. "One day, sir, your money won't matter, but kindness always will." The sentence lifted from Ethan's small chest like a bell and hung over the avenue. It crossed the honking horns, slipped through the steam rising from a subway grate, and pressed itself against the tinted glass of Richard's SUV. For a second, the city's pulse misfired. The guard's hand loosened. Conversations on the sidewalk lost a beat. Even the bakery's door, swinging open and shut with customers, seemed to hesitate mid-arc, as if the hinge itself had heard something it needed to consider. Silence followed, the real kind, the kind that exposes a hidden truth you can't unhear. Once it settles in, Richard tried to look anywhere but at the boy. He adjusted his cufflink, searched his sleeve for a wrinkle, watched a pigeon leap from curb to sky as if it offered an exit route. None of it worked. The words had a gravity of their own, a quiet pull that reached past armor. "Driver," he said, striving for a voice that sounded bored and unbothered. "Let's go." The door closed with a soft thud, but the sentence didn't stay outside. It slipped in before the seal could hold and sat beside him like an uninvited guest. "People say things," he muttered, more to the hum of the engine than to the two guards now facing forward. "They don't know how decisions get made. They don't see the behind the scenes." The rationalization sounded practiced, a script he'd recited so many times that the syllables had stopped meaning anything. He stared at his reflection in the window. Handsome, successful, the measurable impact of years of ambition. And for the first time that morning, his reflection stared back with questions he didn't like. Outside, the boy steadied himself on the curb and watched the SUV ease into traffic. Ethan's face held no hatred. He looked the way someone looks when they say goodbye to something they never had but still hoped for. "I just wanted bread," he said softly, mostly to reassure his own heart that he hadn't asked for too much. He pressed a palm to his stomach and breathed through the ache. A woman, leaving the bakery, slipped a small roll into his hand without a word, eyes glossy with the kind of empathy that arrives too late to prevent the harm, but not too late to acknowledge it. Ethan thanked her with a nod, then turned his gaze after the receding car, as if watching a chapter close. In the SUV, Richard's mind tried to sprint past the echo, to get ahead of it the way he outran other inconveniences, with speed, with schedule, with momentum. "Calendar?" he asked, snapping open his phone. His assistant's voice came through the car's speakers with practiced efficiency, listing a chain of meetings. A pitch in a glass-walled conference room, a lunch on the 43rd floor where the table would be set with silverware heavy enough to declare status. He preferred the sound of logistics. Logistics didn't ask him to change his mindset. Logistics didn't require transformation. Logistics never accused him of anything. "Confirm everything," he said. "And for the record, we don't reward interruptions." The guard nearest the window gave a small nod. Approval, compliance, the choreography of hierarchy. It should have restored the old rhythm. Yet the rhythm felt off, like a song whose chorus arrived a half-second too soon. Traffic stalled near a crosswalk, and the car's forward motion surrendered to the pedestrian tide. Through the glass, Richard caught a final glimpse of the bakery window. Golden crusts, steam clouding the corners, a boy's outline slipping away with a piece of bread cupped in both hands as if it were a fragile treasure. His chest tightened in a way he refused to name. He could have lied, Richard told himself, grasping at any logic that would spare his pride. Kids learn to hustle in this city. The rebuttal didn't land. Ethan hadn't asked for money. He'd asked for food. That detail kept returning like a tide, washing away alibis. By the time the SUV reached the tower that bore his name in chrome, Richard had built a new story in his head, one where he was the protagonist of discipline and the Boy was a lesson in boundaries. He stepped into a lobby polished so perfectly that every light doubled itself on the floor. A receptionist greeted him with the reverence he'd come to expect. "Good morning, Mr. Miller." Elevators opened as if the building inhaled just for him. The world obeyed. On the 40th floor, the usual choreography resumed. Assistants weaving through hallways with folders, colleagues waiting outside his office with questions pre-packaged into decimals and bullet points. The skyline spreading itself like a promise beyond the glass. The conference table glowed under a wash of daylight. He stood at its head, and the room waited. "Let's begin," he said, finding relief in numbers. Earnings, projections, leverage, language that never looks you in the eye and asks who you are when the performance ends. Charts climbed. Applause fluttered like currency. Still, the echo kept time in the space beneath words. During a presentation about a new property, a voice from the back asked about allocation, and Richard blinked as if startled from a dream. For a beat, the phrase, "your money won't matter," braided itself with the term capital structure, and he had to blink again to separate them. It annoyed him that the thread had followed him up here, into the thin air of altitude, where consequences were usually negotiable. At lunch, a client told an amusing story about a celebrity meltdown in Malibu. Laughter circled the table. Richard smiled on cue, cut into a steak with practiced precision, and noticed how even the knife's serrations reflected the skyline in miniature. "People are predictable," the client said. "Pressure exposes them." Richard swallowed. Not the steak, but a thought that tasted like metal. What had pressure just exposed about him? He pushed it down with sparkling water and a statistic about market share. He tried to erase the morning by outrunning it with productivity. Calls were made, deals advanced, a contract sent back with 4 words: clean. "This up now," and his signature glided across a page like a skater over flawless ice. He was performing again. But performances end. When the office dimmed toward evening and the city's lights flicked on one by one like watchful eyes, his reflection returned to the window, older by an hour, haunted by a sentence. "Your money won't matter." He didn't like the part of him that wanted to ask, to whom? He closed his laptop and leaned back, the leather chair sighing the way it always did under the certainty that he had won another day. Except the certainty had hairline fractures. Moments replayed with uncooperative clarity. The boy's thin wrist inside a guard's hand, the way the voice carried, not loud but rooted, the way the bakery door's bell failed to ring, as if it too had stopped to listen. He rubbed his temples. "Be rational," he told himself. "You made a choice. Choices define a journey." He believed that. He'd built an empire on decisions. The problem was never the word. It was which direction the choices pointed when no one else was watching. He put on his coat and took the private elevator down to the garage. The SUV waited, an obedient shadow. "Home," he said, and the driver understood. Manhattan unfurled outside in neon and rain-sheened reflections, the streets rewriting themselves in puddles. They passed a food truck with a line of workers still in paint-splattered jeans. They passed a park bench where someone slept beneath a thin blanket, shoes set neatly at the feet like a small declaration of dignity. "This city never sleeps," the guard in the passenger seat said. Richard heard himself answer, "Some nights it should." He wasn't sure why he said it. The comment surprised the guard enough to turn his head, but not enough to ask a question. At a red light, the car idled beside a bus stop where an advertisement showed a family gathered around a kitchen table, hands extended toward a steaming casserole. The photo was staged, airbrushed, soft-lit, designed to sell a feeling more than a product. It worked for a half-second, then the image pushed against the morning's memory and collapsed into contrast. "Sir," the driver said, because the light had turned green and the SUV hadn't moved. "Go," Richard said quickly, tone sharpening back to the familiar edge that kept the world in order. When they reached the penthouse, the elevator opened into a hush made of expensive materials and clean lines. He poured a drink he didn't want and watched the liquid. tilt against crystal that caught the city's sparkle. The quiet didn't feel like luxury. It felt like being left alone in a room with a truth you'd locked outside all day and now had to face. He set the glass down, untouched. It was a sentence, he told the skyline, frustrated that he was arguing with architecture. It was a child. He turned away from the windows and walked the length of the living room, past art that said he had taste and furniture that said he had arrived. A memory he hadn't. Invited, stepped out from behind another. A boy not unlike Ethan, younger, but with a smaller version of the same stubborn light in his eyes. Richard himself once, in a worn Cincinnati apartment, where the refrigerator hummed like a mechanical lullaby, and his mother stretched groceries with a skill that proved arithmetic could save you until it couldn't. "You promise me something," she'd said, on a night when storms fanned rain against the glass. "If you ever have more than you need, don't forget." What enough felt like. He had answered with the earnest nobility of a child. "I promise." Promises made without power are the easiest to make. Promises remembered after power arrives are the hardest to keep. He glanced back at the skyline as if it might offer an alibi. Instead, the city blinked at him with indifferent lights. He tried to put the memory away, the way he tidied documents into folders, but it didn't file neatly. The sentence returned, now threaded to his mother's voice. "Your money won't matter. Don't forget what enough felt like. Separate lines, same melody." It irritated him that the music fit. Sleep came late and thin. When he did drift off, he dreamed, not of mergers or penthouse views, but of that bakery door. In the dream, the bell rang and no one came to the counter. Loaves cooled into stone. He woke with the tight feeling in his chest again, and the city already awake. Ships of headlights moving down the streets below like fleets returning from battle. He stood at the window and watched dawn flip the skyline from steel to gold, then back to steel. "Today," he said to his own reflection, hearing how brittle the word sounded. "Today I will—" He didn't finish the sentence, perhaps because there was only one ending that made sense, and it required a shift he wasn't ready to name. He dressed with more precision than usual, as if the right knot at his throat could keep something from slipping. In the garage, he paused by the SUV's rear door. "Different route," he told the driver. "Take 6th. The guard looked over, puzzled. 6th wouldn't shave time off the commute. Richard didn't explain. He felt like a man walking back down a hallway toward a door he'd closed too quickly, unsure whether he was going to knock or keep going. They passed the bakery. It was open again, warmth steaming the glass from the inside. A new tray of loaves sat where yesterday's had enticed. For a flicker of an instant, he wanted to tell the driver to stop, but the command stalled. In his mouth. "Later," he said instead, the compromise of a man who wants the virtue without the exposure. The car moved on, but he craned his neck to see the corner one moment longer, as if the extra angle might change the scene. He spent the morning constructing reasons not to return. Meetings stacked themselves into a fort, yet in the open spaces between appointments, the sentence appeared with uncoachable consistency. He finally surrendered at noon and sent a message. "Cancel lunch." The assistant wrote back, surprised but obedient. "Shall I reschedule, Mr. Miller?" He kept his reply neutral. "Not yet." He took the elevator alone this time, let the lobby's polished floor reflect him without entourage, and stepped into a light rain that had started just as he decided to leave. On the sidewalk, a courier dodged a puddle and a saxophone practiced somewhere 3 stories up, its notes drifting down like patience. Richard turned his collar against the drizzle and walked. A man who made maps for other people, but now followed a route that didn't exist in his schedule. He didn't know exactly what he would say. He only knew he couldn't keep hearing a sentence and pretending it hadn't landed. The bakery bell finally rang, bright and ordinary. He bought 2 loaves, the paper bags warming his hands. As he stepped back onto the sidewalk, he scanned the block with a focus he usually reserved for term sheets and line items. The city offered 1,000 doorways and 1,000 places to disappear. He moved toward the corner where the echo had first found him, wondering, without quite admitting it, what would happen if the boy's eyes met his again, and the journey that sentence started needed an answer spoken out loud. Richard forced a laugh, the kind that echoed more like glass cracking than genuine amusement. It was sharp, short, and empty, a sound meant to convince the world and himself that the boy's words had slid off his armor without leaving a mark. "Kids will say anything," he muttered, brushing an invisible speck from his sleeve, as if dismissing both the child and the sting in his chest. But inside, the sentence didn't dissolve. It burrowed. The echo of Ethan's voice, soft yet unyielding, replayed against the walls of Richard's pride like a stone ricocheting in a canyon. "One day, your money won't matter, but kindness always will." The phrase worked its way beneath his polished exterior. At first, he tried to swat it away like a fly, annoying, irrelevant, something beneath his notice, but it didn't leave. It pressed harder, sinking into places Richard rarely visited anymore. He shifted in the leather seat of the SUV, his body restless in ways his mind didn't want to admit. Pride told him to laugh it off, to label the child as naive. Conscience whispered that maybe the boy had spoken a truth money couldn't erase. The driver glanced in the rearview mirror, perhaps sensing the sudden tension in his employer's posture. Richard caught the look and straightened his shoulders. "Focus on the road," he snapped, but even his own voice betrayed him, carrying a thin layer of unease beneath the command. The guards exchanged a glance but said nothing. Silence became another character in the car, thick and intrusive, joining the conversation without invitation. He closed his eyes for a moment, but instead of peace, he saw the boy's face. Thin, tired, yet still holding that strange dignity. Richard clenched his jaw. "He doesn't know what he's talking about," he whispered under his breath. "Money is everything. Without it, there's nothing." Yet even as he spoke, the words tasted bitter, as though he was arguing with someone who had already won. The car rolled through the streets of Manhattan, neon reflections sliding across the windows, but Richard's mind wasn't in the city anymore. It wandered backward, into places he had worked hard to bury. He saw himself as a boy, no older than Ethan, sitting at a chipped kitchen table in Ohio. His mother's hands, cracked from endless shifts, folded over his as she pushed a plate toward him. The plate was nearly empty, but she smiled anyway. "Eat, Richie. I'm not hungry." He knew she was lying. He had believed her then, but the memory now burned like a hidden truth uncovered. He shook his head sharply, as if the memory could be erased by force. "That was then," he told himself. "This is now. I built something. I don't owe anyone anything." Yet, the more he repeated it, the weaker it sounded. The boy's words had peeled back layers of armor that Richard thought were unbreakable. He could feel a battle unfolding inside, a war between the arrogance that had carried him to the top and the conscience he thought he'd long silenced. The SUV slowed at a red light. Outside, two teenagers laughed as they shared a slice of pizza on the sidewalk, tearing it in half, one giving the bigger piece to the other without hesitation. Richard stared at them longer than he meant to, his chest tightening at the effortless kindness of the gesture. It was nothing to them, but to him it looked like something priceless. He turned away quickly, ashamed of the way it unsettled him. Back at his tower, the lobby swallowed him with its marble and gold, the kind of wealth designed to impress anyone who entered. Richard usually found comfort in its shine, but today the polished surfaces reflected back a man who looked less certain. He walked toward the elevators, the clicking of his shoes on, the marble echoing too loudly in his ears. His reflection in the mirror-paneled walls looked back with unfamiliar weight, as though even the glass had heard the boy's words. By the time he reached his office, he was suffocating under his own silence. He poured a drink, the amber liquid trembling slightly as it hit the glass. He took a sip, then another, but it didn't wash the voice away. Instead, the alcohol seemed to amplify it. "Your money won't matter, but kindness always will." He slammed the glass onto his desk harder than he intended, and the sound startled him. He leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. "What does a kid know about money?" he muttered. "He's never had it. He doesn't understand how the world works." But the rationalizations crumbled faster than he could build them. The truth was simple. The boy hadn't been talking about money. He had been talking about legacy, about humanity, about the things Richard had traded away for skyscrapers and cars, and guards in black suits. Hours passed, but the battle didn't end. On one side was the voice that had always driven him, cold, calculating, insisting that power and wealth were the only shields against pain. On the other side was a whisper he hadn't heard in years, the voice of his younger self, the boy at that chipped kitchen table, who once believed promises meant something. The clash left him exhausted, his pride trembling under the weight of questions he didn't want to face. By nightfall, the city outside glowed with artificial light, but inside his penthouse, Richard sat in the dark, staring at the skyline. The view had always been his symbol of victory, proof that he had conquered everything he set out to. Tonight, it looked different. The towers felt hollow, as if the city itself was asking him a question he couldn't answer. He rubbed his temples, but the voice persisted. And then, as if to deepen the wound, his phone buzzed with a message from his assistant. "Great job today, Mr. Miller. Everyone respects you. You have an impact no one can match." He read the words, but they felt empty, like flattery tossed onto a fire that had already gone out. Respect, impact, influence. They were the currencies he had lived by. Yet, in that quiet room, none of them mattered as much as the echo of a starving child, reminding him of a truth he couldn't escape. He poured another drink, but didn't touch it. Instead, he stood and walked toward the window, pressing his palm against the cold glass. Below, the city moved on, oblivious to his turmoil. He wondered how many people passed each other every day with words unspoken, kindness withheld, chances wasted. He wondered if his own life, built on pride, might collapse under the weight of one undeniable sentence. Richard closed his eyes, and for the first time in years, he felt small, not because of failure, but because of recognition. He was beginning to understand that the boy's words hadn't been an insult. They had been a revelation, a seed planted in the cracks of his pride, one that no amount of laughter, wealth, or arrogance could uproot. And though he tried to bury it, the battle inside was only just beginning. Pride still fought for dominance, whispering that he had too much to lose, while conscience urged him toward something unfamiliar but undeniably human. The clash was exhausting, relentless, but it promised something he hadn't felt in years, the possibility of change. As the night deepened and the city hummed below, Richard remained by the window, torn between the man he had been and the man those words were asking him to become. And while he didn't yet know which side would win, he knew one thing with unsettling clarity. His life would never again feel untouched by the voice of a hungry child who had nothing but truth to give. Night pressed against the glass of the penthouse like a tide that refused to recede. Richard lay in the dark, the ceiling a cold expanse he had never really looked at. Before, listening to the low mechanical hush of the city, elevators sliding, a distant siren, a horn swallowed by rain. Sleep would not come. It hovered somewhere outside the room, unimpressed by his wealth, indifferent to his schedule. He turned his pillow, turned it again, and finally sat up with a frustrated exhale. Even the silence felt expensive here, but for once, none of it soothed him. Ethan's sentence was back in the room, uninvited and unmovable, repeating with quiet precision as if time itself had decided it would be the only sound permitted until morning. One day, your money won't matter, but kindness always will. He tried to answer it, to negotiate with it the way he negotiated deals, but the words offered no counterparty, only a mirror. He left the bed and crossed the living room, passing sculptures and canvases he had selected for the way they suggested taste. The floor-to-ceiling windows opened onto the skyline, a theater of lights and shadows that usually reminded him he had won. Tonight the city looked like a jury. He pressed his palm to the glass and felt the cool refusal of it. "It's ridiculous," he said softly, annoyed at the way his voice sounded like a plea. "I didn't do anything wrong." The sentence immediately folded under its own weight. He had done something. It just wasn't the kind of thing that left a mark on a ledger. It was the kind that left a mark somewhere you couldn't audit. He poured water and drank it too quickly. "I built this," he told the empty room, not because it needed persuading, but because he did. "I made decisions. I did what was necessary." The word decisions slid around his tongue and didn't settle. If he followed it to its end, it led somewhere he didn't want to go. A hallway lined with moments he had reframed as efficiency, the assistant he'd scolded for asking for time off to care for a parent, the supplier he'd squeezed until their voice cracked, the way he'd measured people by the usefulness of their entrances and exits from his orbit. He had always called it strategy. Tonight it looked like a mindset built to keep human things at a distance. He turned away from the window, and the room shifted with him, as if his unresolved thoughts rearranged its angles. A photograph on the credenza caught his eye, the only personal image he allowed in public spaces. He'd had it professionally framed so it would look deliberate, not sentimental. Him at 28, standing in front of a construction site. That would become the first building with his name on it. He was thinner then, and his expression was a blueprint for the man he became. Jaw steady, gaze unblinking, a kind of steel you mistake for virtue when it wins. He stared at the picture longer than he ever had. "You were certain," he whispered to the younger face. "How were you so certain?" The answer didn't come from the photograph. It came from farther back, from a room with peeling paint in Cincinnati, where certainty had been an invention crafted to survive a week at a time, memory unspooled without asking permission. His mother stood at the stove, stirring a pot that looked generous but smelled thin. "Stretch it," she'd say, turning poverty into a recipe. "You stretch it, Richie, and you learn to make almost enough feel like enough." He saw himself at 8, watching the door, because sometimes his father walked through it, carrying pay that wasn't enough, but felt like hope, and sometimes he didn't. His mother set a plate in front of him and smiled as if plates could be convincing. "Eat while it's warm." He had believed warmth could be a meal. It bothered him now to remember how grateful he was for the performance. "I'm not hungry," she'd tell him when he pushed the plate back. "You eat." He had eaten then, because love asked him to. He felt the old confusion in his chest, the one that came from obeying an adult's lie because the lie was kindness. He stepped back from the credenza, as though the photograph might accuse him. "I left," he said, setting the glass down carefully, aligning it with the edge of a book, as if neatness could quiet his pulse. "I worked. I made sure I would never be that kid again." Another sentence rose to meet his, a recollection he had misplaced. "If you ever have more than you need, don't forget what enough felt like." His mother's voice was a low chord that filled the room with the part of him he had locked away. He wanted to answer it with numbers. He wanted to say he couldn't afford to remember enough because forgetting had financed his ascent. But the defense rang hollow in the presence of the boy on the sidewalk who had asked only for bread. The hidden truth of his success, the one he avoided by living at altitude, was that altitude thins the air you breathe. You climb so high you can't smell a bakery anymore. He walked to the kitchen and opened the refrigerator even though he wasn't hungry. Shelves of precision stared back at him, labeled containers, a row of green bottles, a takeout box that had never been eaten. He closed the door, and the soft suction made him feel absurdly like he was shutting something out. "Kindness will not pay rent," he said to the hum of the compressor, repeating a line he had delivered to men many times over the years. It sounded less like strategy now, and more like a confession. He could no longer pretend he didn't know the cost of the sentence he had dismissed on the street. It wanted something from him that none of his contracts required. It wanted him to step from behind the scenes of his curated life and into the raw light of an unplanned interaction. He sat at the dining table with his laptop open, the screen a bright rectangle waiting for anything. His calendar blinked with appointments that gave his day meaning because they filled it. He created a new note and typed words as if he were writing to a stranger he needed to convince. Maintain discipline. Protect boundaries. No to street solicitations. He stared at the lines and deleted them one by one until there was only the blinking cursor, steady as a heartbeat. In its rhythm he heard Ethan again. He heard the steady courage of a child's voice that had chosen truth over survival tactics. He dragged his palms over his face. "What do you want from me?" he asked, and immediately felt the correction inside his own question. The boy hadn't asked to take, he had asked to receive. The difference was a door Richard had kept closed. He checked the time, past 2. The city had settled a little, but even its tiredness sounded alive compared to the dead, conditioned air of the room. He stood and walked a slow perimeter of the penthouse as if he were guarding something. The past followed. He saw himself at 15, lifting boxes in the back of a discount store to help at home. He remembered the way the manager looked at him, like he was both necessary and replaceable, and how he had sworn then to build a life where no one could ever look at him that way again. He had kept that promise so carefully that he had become the man who looked at others that way. The realization moved through him like a bruise deepening. "That's not me," he said to the dark. "I'm not cruel." But he couldn't unspool the tape and find a version of himself on the street that afternoon who had been anything else. His phone buzzed with an alert. A wire transfer had posted. Another deal had closed. Numbers stacked themselves, proof that the machine worked. He felt nothing. Not triumph, not relief. The emptiness was new because he usually didn't feel emptiness. He felt efficiency. This was different. It was the quiet that followed after a reveal, the kind a magician lives inside once the trick has been explained and everyone knows where the wires are. You can still perform it, but you can't make yourself believe it anymore. "So, this is what it costs," he said, recognizing with a shock of clarity that the price of living without softness is that you eventually owe a debt to your own humanity, and the interest compounds. He went back to the window and watched a delivery driver jog across the intersection with a bag held high to keep it from the puddles. The man reached a building, disappeared into the lobby, and came out lighter. Richard envied the simple arc of it. Carry something someone needs, deliver it, be done. He had built complex arcs that required teams and contracts and signatures. The boy's sentence had stripped his world back to first principles and found it wanting. He rested his forehead against the glass. "I don't know how to fix the whole thing," he admitted, the words both terrifying and clean. "But I know I could have given him bread." He replayed the scene with infuriating clarity. Ethan's thin fingers on the window, the soft plea, the snap of his own dismissal. He tried to argue again that he had protected a boundary, but the boundary belonged to a fortress he no longer wanted to live in. The weight in his chest shifted from defense to accountability. Guilt arrived unadorned by drama, light as a hand on a shoulder and heavy as everything it implied. Emptiness followed it in, a space where certainty used to be. For the first time in years, he allowed both to sit with him without muting them with work or whiskey. They didn't shout, they didn't accuse, they waited. He found himself speaking into the quiet like a man at confessional without a priest. "I was hungry once," he said, and felt the word once open, like a trap door, revealing a behind-the-scenes that even he didn't visit. "I know what it feels like to want something basic and be told to wait." He could hear his own breath, the soft friction of it in the room, as if the admission had brought a different kind of oxygen. The boy's sentence didn't sound like a threat anymore. It sounded like permission to step into a different mathematics, one that values impact measured in small mercies as much as in market share. He didn't put language to it, but he recognized the blueprint of a transformation beginning inside him. Pride was still there, suspicious of anything that asked for change, whispering that kindness would make him vulnerable and that vulnerability would invite loss. Conscience stood its ground, not with fury but with clarity, reminding him that the only thing truly fragile was a legacy built on fear. He looked again at the photograph of his younger self, the ambitious man on the brink of his empire, and imagined asking him a question he'd never had time for. What kind of man do you want to be when no one is watching? The room paused with him, as if it too was waiting for the answer. When dawn finally sketched a thin line of grey along the edge of the buildings, Richard hadn't slept. He buttoned a fresh shirt and watched his hands as if they belonged to someone he was still deciding to know. The mirror did not return the usual verdict of control. It returned a man who had been interrupted and who had not yet chosen what to do with the interruption. He picked up his keys and set them down again. He had built a life where movement was a way to avoid choosing. Now the stillness itself demanded a decision. He stood in the doorway a long minute, the penthouse at his back, the elevator waiting like a blank page. He didn't plan a speech, he didn't draft a statement or rehearse a performance, but the question had become clear enough to move his feet. What do you do? Not when you are asked for a great sacrifice, but when you are asked for a small kindness that your pride refused yesterday. The city below was already in motion, the avenue waking, the bakery warming the air with the promise of first loaves. He stepped into the hall, not because he knew what would happen next, but because the journey from avoidance to responsibility begins with a door that opens before you have a script for the scene you're walking into. Morning in New York began with its usual symphony of horns, footsteps, and conversations rising with the steam from subway grates. But for Richard Miller, the city sounded different. He had stepped out of his tower with a weight in his chest and an urgency that felt alien, like a new rhythm he wasn't used to moving with. His polished shoes struck the pavement in a measured pace, not the usual rush of a man with meetings stacked and contracts waiting. Today, he wasn't chasing profit. He was searching for a boy. The previous night's unrest still clung to him. He had gone through the motions, brushed his teeth, buttoned his shirt, tied his tie with perfect symmetry, but none of it had erased the echoes of Ethan's words. Your money won't matter, but kindness always will. He repeated the sentence in his head like an incantation, both painful and necessary. For the first time in years, his reflection in the mirror hadn't offered reassurance. Instead, it had forced him to ask a question that refused to be buried. If wealth meant nothing when measured against kindness, then what kind of man was he? He took a different route that morning, away from the glass and chrome comfort of the financial district toward the bakery where the encounter had shattered his certainty. The smell of bread once again drifted into the street, warm and familiar, but he wasn't here for food. He scanned the sidewalks, searching faces, his heart unexpectedly anxious. He has to be here, he whispered to himself, voice tinged with something he hadn't allowed in years, hope. For several minutes, he found nothing but strangers, people wrapped in their routines, moving too quickly to notice the man in the tailored suit looking out of place. Just as doubt began to creep in, he spotted a familiar figure near the corner, small and hunched against the morning chill. Ethan sat on the curb, his bare feet pressed against the cold pavement, nibbling slowly on a crust of bread that someone must have given him. Richard's breath caught in his throat. The boy looked thinner than he remembered, but his eyes, those steady, unyielding eyes, still held the same spark. Without thinking, Richard crossed the street, his guards a few steps behind but hesitant, unsure of what was unfolding. As he approached, Ethan looked up, startled at first, then wary. "You again," the boy said quietly, his voice carrying a mixture of recognition and mistrust. Richard stopped just a few feet away. For a long moment, he didn't know how to begin. He had spent a lifetime rehearsing negotiations, closing deals with carefully chosen words. But this wasn't business. This was something raw, and the script was gone. Slowly, deliberately, he lowered himself onto one knee until his eyes were level with Ethan's. The sight itself drew stares from passers-by, a millionaire kneeling on the sidewalk in front of a child. Yet Richard didn't care about appearances, not now. "I was wrong yesterday," he said softly, his voice stripped of its usual authority. "I shouldn't have treated you that way." He paused, searching for words that could bridge the distance pride had built. "You asked me for bread, and I turned you away. I've been thinking about it ever since. And you were right. Money won't matter when everything else fades. But kindness can change everything." Ethan blinked, his thin fingers tightening around the piece of bread. "Why are you telling me this now?" he asked, suspicion sharp in his tone. "Because I don't want to be the man I was yesterday," Richard replied. "I don't want to be remembered for pushing people away. I want to be remembered for standing beside them." The words left his mouth with surprising ease, as though he had been carrying them for years, waiting for the right moment to finally let them go. The boy studied him carefully, the way someone who has been disappointed too often learns to weigh promises. Richard could feel the scrutiny, the silent question of whether this was another performance. For once, he had no armor. His tie, his suit, his wealth, they meant nothing here. What mattered was whether the boy could see the hidden truth in his eyes. That pride had cracked, and something real was finally breaking through. "I don't want to give you just a meal," Richard continued, his voice steady. "I want to give you shelter, education, and care. Not because it will make me look good, not because I need to clear my conscience, but because you deserve it. You deserve a chance at a different life." Ethan looked down, his silence stretching, into the hum of the city around them. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter but firmer. "People make promises all the time. They don't keep them." Richard nodded, the admission cutting deep. "I know, and maybe I don't deserve your trust yet, but I'm asking for the chance to earn it." For a moment it seemed the boy would turn away, retreating back into the armor of disbelief that life had forced him to wear. But then something shifted in his eyes, a flicker of recognition perhaps, that even the proudest man could be humbled. Ethan didn't smile, but he didn't pull back either, and in that silence Richard felt a door open. The guards, unsure of what to do, stood frozen at a distance. The bakery's customers watched with curiosity, some whispering, others stunned by the sight of a man they knew by reputation, bending low in humility before a barefoot child. The imbalance of power that had once defined the moment was gone. In its place stood something fragile but extraordinary. Two human beings meeting on equal ground. Richard reached into the bakery bag he carried and pulled out a fresh loaf, warm enough that the steam still curled from its crust. He broke it in half and extended a piece to Ethan. "For now," he said softly, "let's start with this." Ethan hesitated, then took it. His fingers brushed Richard's hand, a simple touch that felt heavier than any contract Richard had ever signed. It wasn't forgiveness yet. It wasn't trust, but it was the beginning of both. As Ethan bit into the bread, Richard remained on his knee, unmoving, as though afraid that standing too soon might shatter the fragile transformation already underway. For the first time in years, he felt no urge to rush, no need to calculate. He simply stayed, breathing the same air as the boy whose words had pierced his pride and begun to rewrite the story of his life. The city carried on around them, unaware that on one small corner, a man had chosen to be something more than his wealth. But Richard knew, and Ethan knew, and in that knowledge, a journey neither of them had planned was beginning, one that would test not just generosity, but endurance, trust, and the kind of compassion that leaves an impact long after the moment has passed. Richard stood slowly, not as the powerful millionaire people recognized, but as a man who had taken his first step into something unknown. And as Ethan looked up at him with cautious eyes, the story of arrogance and innocence shifted into something new, something still fragile but undeniably alive, waiting for what would come next. The city seemed unchanged on the surface. Cars still pressed through intersections, people hurried with coffee cups in hand, and the bakery bell still chimed with the same bright note every time the door opened. But for Richard Miller, nothing looked the same anymore. He walked slower than usual, the sound of his shoes against the sidewalk, no longer a performance of power, but the rhythm of a man deep in thought. The loaf of bread Ethan had accepted weighed heavier in his memory than any skyscraper he had built. For the first time, he wasn't thinking about numbers or margins, but about the impact of one small decision. It was unsettling and liberating at once, like standing in a room where the lights had finally been switched on after years of shadows. Wealth had always been Richard's armor, a shield that built walls so high that no one could climb them. Those walls had given him privacy, control, and the illusion of safety, but they had also left him alone. He realized that every decision made from pride had cost him something invisible but irreplaceable. He had spent decades accumulating, but in the process, he had also been subtracting. Arrogance had blinded him to the truth that humility could reveal, and all it had taken was a hungry child's voice to dismantle the structure he thought was indestructible. That morning replayed in his mind like a film. Ethan's small hand tapping on the window, his whisper of hunger, the snap of fingers that dismissed him, and finally the words that cut deeper than any business rivalry ever had. Richard thought about how many times in his life he had chosen to dismiss, to walk past, to silence. If every one of those moments had been an opportunity, how much had he truly lost? He didn't want to calculate it. For the first time, he wanted to feel it, because feeling was what had been missing all along. Wealth may build walls, Richard murmured to himself as he crossed the street, but kindness breaks them. The sentence felt alive in his mouth, not as a statement of theory, but as a hidden truth revealed through experience. Kindness didn't require a boardroom, a contract, or an audience. It required presence, and Ethan, with nothing but honesty and empty hands, had managed to offer the one thing Richard hadn't bought in years: clarity. He remembered the way people had stared when he knelt down, their shock that a man like him would lower himself in public. Once, he would have recoiled from that image, terrified of what it would do to his reputation. But now, he understood something new. Lowering himself hadn't diminished him. It had transformed him. Pride had masqueraded as strength for so long that he had forgotten real strength was found in surrender, in the courage to admit you had been wrong, and the humility to change because of it. The boy had given him more than a challenge. He had given him a gift. Richard had gone, to find Ethan believing he was the one offering redemption, but in truth, it was Ethan who had offered him a second chance at being human. The greatest irony of all was that it hadn't come from wealth or authority, but from vulnerability. A child with no shoes had cracked open the heart of a man who owned towers. That was the paradox Richard could no longer escape. He looked again at the world around him, the endless flow of people, some with shoulders hunched from burdens, others with eyes glazed, or from exhaustion. For the first time in years, he didn't see strangers as part of the background. He saw them as stories, each carrying a journey, each shaped by decisions, by loss, by fleeting acts of compassion or neglect. He wondered how many other Ethans were out there, invisible, until their voices broke through the noise. How many more moments had he missed because he had been too busy guarding his pride? The revelation was simple yet overwhelming. Pride builds legacies that crumble when one is left to admire them, but love builds legacies that endure because they live on in people, not buildings. Ethan had taught him that with a single sentence. Richard had spent a lifetime chasing the kind of immortality that comes from names carved into stone, but he now realized the only immortality worth having comes from the way you leave others better than you found them. He thought again of his mother's words. Don't forget what enough felt like. Enough, he realized, had nothing to do with numbers. Enough was bread shared at the right moment. Enough was listening instead of dismissing. Enough was kindness that arrived in time to remind someone they mattered. And perhaps, more than anything, enough was the courage to see that legacy is not measured in fortune, but in love. Richard paused near the bakery window, watching as Ethan slowly finished the loaf he had given him. The boy still looked wary, still cautious, but there was a quiet trust building between them, fragile but undeniable. Richard knew he couldn't undo the harm of yesterday, but he could choose differently today and tomorrow and the days after that. That was the hidden truth of transformation. It wasn't about one grand gesture, but about consistent choices that turned humility into a way of living. He had always believed pride made him powerful. Now he knew pride had only made him alone. It was love, fragile and unassuming, that carried the strength to endure. Ethan had reminded him that walls eventually fall, no matter how high they are built, but kindness could outlast them all. And so Richard walked forward, not as the man he had been, but as the man he was becoming. The city kept moving, unaware of the quiet revolution unfolding inside him. Yet for anyone willing to see, the lesson was there, waiting. Wealth may build walls, but kindness breaks them. Pride may masquerade as strength, but a hungry child had proven otherwise. And in the end, Richard learned the greatest truth of all: only love leaves a legacy. The story didn't belong to Richard alone. It belonged to anyone who had ever been blinded by ego, anyone who had ever measured worth in numbers instead of people, anyone who had ever walked past a moment of compassion and realized later what it had cost. The question was not just for him, but for all who listened. When the walls you've built finally come down, what will remain standing in your name? And if you've walked with me all the way to this point, maybe the story stirred something in you too. If it did, leave a comment down below with a simple phrase like, "I'm with you until the end," or "This message was for me." It's always powerful to see how these stories connect us. And while you're here, don't forget to tap the like button. It's a small gesture, but it tells me this kind of content matters to you as much as it does to me. If you want to keep journeying through stories that bring meaning and reflection, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what's coming next. And now, let's keep the conversation flowing. There's a video right here that complements this story beautifully. Click it, and let's continue together on the next chapter.